Microphone. So again, my name is Kizzy Charles Guzman from the New York City Health Department, running a program on climate change and public health, and formerly from the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability and working on Plan YC. So that was kind of like the origin of this capstone. We have, you're going to hear from two groups tonight. Their charge was to identify an environmental problem in New York City within two topics that I'll tell you about in a second, and they were supposed to solve that problem as if that was a small feat. So you will be hearing from a group that was given the task of looking at the New York City waterfront and addressing any challenges that they saw with the redevelopment process and the revitalization of those waterfronts and how to incorporate climate change adaptation planning into that work. And then the second group is going to talk about a legislative approach to handling solid waste from our city's institutions. So they will be talking to you about plastic bags. So without further ado, I want to welcome the group that will be talking to you about climate adaptation in the New York City waterfront.
Thank you very much, Kizzy. Alright, let's full screen mode. It's amazing to see so many familiar faces. My name is Steven Rosowski, and on behalf of my group, we worked on the waterfront development team. And I would like to share the story of how we developed an initiative that will hopefully be the first step in redefining flood protection standards here in New York City. So to start off, we took this massive topic of waterfront development and started looking at what are some of the trends that we can find going on here. And something that quickly jumped out at us was the big elephant in the room, climate change. So this is what we got on one hand, that climate is actually changing on an international, also local level. And combine that with the policy that's happening in the city right now, where waterfront is actually developing and revitalizing, we're actually trying to bring more and more residential units to the waterfront. And this is in part due to the fact that by 2030, we're gonna have about 1 million more residents in New York City. So at the crossroads of this, we can find that we're at a time period now where policy decisions that we make today will affect years to come. And so here, this map actually done up at Columbia illustrates what flood would look like in New York City. This was actually based on Hurricane Irene. And what we can see is that flooding is a huge burden on the waterfront community. That's mainly where it would affect. So that's why we wanted to create an initiative that would kind of address these issues in a way that would be very comprehensive. So this is kind of the situation now. But looking forward, since NYC is planning now, we can see that by 2070, we're looking at a totally different picture. In fact, New York City will be the third most at-risk city in the entire world in terms of economic assets exposed. What does this look like? Well, 3 million people would be at risk for flooding in 2070. And the exposed assets would be approximately $2,147.5 billion. And that number is so vast that we had to actually bring in some sort of comparison to allow people to understand what that means. And we couldn't use something little like toasters or anything. That'd be way too many toasters. So we took something huge like the Apple Corporation. And so actually the flood risk, the assets at risk, would equate to about 7 times the net worth of Apple Corporation. So that is, it's a massive issue, absolutely, and the bulk of that burden would lie on waterfront communities. So our proposal, in a nutshell, is to make sure that New York City flood protection standards rise to the challenge of climate change. And to say that in a more technical way, we want to move from our current paradigm of 1 in 100 year flood protections to 1 in 1,000. So now I'm going to illustrate kind of how we got to this initiative. And the first thing you're probably wondering was, what the heck is a 1 in 1,000 flood protection level? Well, here's New York City today, and geographically speaking, we are at flood risk because to the south of us we have the Atlantic Ocean. Over at the east we have the Long Island Sound, and so these are two large bodies of water that, connected with the Hudson River estuary, create our waterfront of 520 miles of coastline, actually. And so this is what New York City looks like today. And under a 1 in 100 year flooding scenario, which is essentially a flood that is predicted to occur about every 1 in 100 years, or per year you have a 1% chance of this occurring. And it's about a 3-meter storm surge, which is about 15 feet. This is what it would look like. We would start having places like John F. Kennedy would start going underwater. Places in Queens and Brooklyn would start going underwater. And then if we look at a more intense scenario of a 1 in 1,000 year flood, or about 4.5 meters, we see a much more drastic, actually. And what's interesting is this is a very conservative model right here, because it's not accounting for storm surge, which is actually when the hurricane or something like that would come in and actually blow this water in. So this is the least kind of damage that we could see, and already a lot of the west side of Manhattan would be affected. A lot of Queens, as we can see, Far Rockaways are totally underwater under this 4.5 meter scenario. So talking about the climate science really quickly, the New York City Panel on Climate Change, these guys are the experts on localized climate risk data. They created this really nifty chart that pretty much puts together the main factors in the changes that we're going to see. And the first one that we can look at is precipitation. We're looking at a 5 to 10% precipitation increase by the 2080s. Couple that with sea level rise, which is a really interesting factor because we don't really know what's going to happen. It could be anywhere from 12 to 55 inches, and to put that in perspective, 55 inches is about almost 5 feet. And if you put on top of that Hurricane Irene, what ended up happening here was about a 3.6 meter storm surge. That right there would equate to a 100-year flood, 1 in 100-year flood. So put those together, when you add in the fact that we're going to have increased storms in severity and also in intensity and also in how often they happen, you have kind of a concluding statement that 1 in 100-year floods are predicted to occur about 4 times more often by the end of the century. So switching gears a little bit, how do we get to this point in our history of the waterfront? Well, starting off, New York City was actually the second largest port in the city. And it was bustling. I mean, it was massive, working waterfronts, merchants. And then, unfortunately, after World War II, containerization happened. A lot of these shipping areas went over to New Jersey. And so a lot of the waterfront became abandoned. Fast forward to the 1990s, and you get to a point where the city wants to really revitalize and bring life back to these places that were abandoned. And so it created its first comprehensive guide to create development on the waterfront. And we have wonderful examples of this: Dumbo, Williamsburg, the Chelsea Piers, as you can see here, and many others around the city. So it's doing, but while it's planning waterfront development, it's doing so in a long-term sort of planning way. And the two main documents to really look at here are Plan YC, which many of you are probably familiar with. It's the Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability's master frame document on how to do development sustainably until 2030, as well as Vision 2020, which is a comprehensive waterfront agenda. And what these two things do together is actually a lot of cool flood management techniques, such as updating building codes and basically reaching out to the public and making them aware of flood hazards. These are based on the NPCC, as I mentioned earlier, on their climate risk information. The one problem we found with them is that they're all based on 1 in 100 year flooding scenarios. So we wanted to find some precedent. What are other cities doing, and how do New Yorkers match up? We found not so well. We looked at places like Hamburg, London, Tokyo, Amsterdam, and Shanghai, and we found out that they're all protected for 1 in 1,000 year floods, whereas we're only for 1 in 100 year floods. So we started thinking, this adds to the picture, not only in terms of the climate data that's happening, but the policy around the world. We're lagging behind. So we looked at 15 different cities all around the world, and one of them was Hamburg. So just to quickly illustrate a key takeaway from there, Hamburg, Germany is, just like New York City, is located on an estuary, has similar flooding characteristics as New York. Additionally, it's historically a port city that's undergoing revitalization right now. But a really cool thing that they integrated into their planning process was a 1 in 1,000 year storm surge protection. And this equates for them to about a 7.5 meter elevation rise. And on the right here, I was actually in Hamburg earlier this year, and it was really neat to see how they were able to execute this. They actually literally elevate all the buildings and public infrastructure to be outside of the 7.5 meter storm surge zone. So this is a really neat example of a best practice on how to implement flooding protection. Second, we had London, and they did some really cool construction best practices, including one that was a floodgate for residential buildings. And we don't have anything like this, but it's a very simple concept. Essentially, this floodgate, you can just close it and it gives you 2 feet of flood protection because it's totally waterproof. Another really important thing to look at was what kind of policy did they have to kind of implement their strategies. And so 2 things that we looked at were the sequential and exception test. And very briefly, what that means is if I were a developer, I need to develop on land that has less flooding risk before I develop on land that has greater flooding risk. So let's say I own a ½ an acre, I have to develop on the higher part of the land before I go down to the lower part and make sure that my critical infrastructure is over here. Secondly, the exception test is I need to prove to the city that whatever I'm building there isn't increasing the flood risk for other buildings around me, and it provides a net benefit to the city even though it's in a flood risk plane. So together, these case studies started illustrating a entire framework that we started looking at a goal of 1 in 1,000 flooding and an associated framework to make that happen. And 2 of the really key points here that I would like to show are an integrated planning process, something like we see in London, the sequential and exception test, or something like from Hamburg, where you literally plan an entire neighborhood and say, we need to elevate this out of the flood zone. And then the other one is best practices for construction. I only named one, but there are so many really innovative things that other cities are doing that we can really look at and call those best practices and see what they can do here. So that's why we wanted to propose a study conducted by the NPCC to actually look into the feasibility of redefining New York City flood protection standards to get us from 1 in 100 to the international standard of 1 in 1,000. So the implementation, just very quickly, essentially our study would be housed in the New York City Panel on Climate Change. They're the ones who produce the localized climate data for New York City. And we thought that this would be a really great place to house the study because the NPCC is an advisory board for the Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. And so whatever recommendations come out of that can directly be implemented into the planning process. And so we figured as we're planning and we're developing the waterfront now, it's really a great time to bring up this dialogue and start talking about how can we make this development sustainable. Financing is usually the part where we get to and it's like, oh no, financing, but this is a study, so it's not very capital intensive, which is really nice because right now that's kind of a killer. The Rockefeller Foundation has set precedent in funding the NPCC, and our study would actually receive a part of that funding stream. We would be housed within the NPCC. So as the studies go forward, essentially what we would be a part of the portfolio that the NPCC says, this is the research we're doing and gets funding going forward. So what are the project deliverables? What are we actually going to create here? Well, it's going to be 2 main studies, and the first one's going to be more of an inventory. So looking at the feasibility, the actual methodologies of reaching a 1 in 1,000 flood protection level in New York City. What are the actual on-ground things that we can do or planning processes that we can implement to make this happen? And what would the expected costs be? The second document would be a more overarching, actually more in-depth assessment of feasibility, where we would actually look into the stakeholders that would be involved in such changes. So who would be against it? Who would be for it? Then we look into policy measures. What would we actually have to pass to get some of these things to happen in the city? And then finally, what is the potential timeline for implementation on such a project? To conclude, I would just like to say that through our research, we really found that New York City is, in fact, at a crossroads now. We are planning our waterfronts. Our waterfronts are susceptible to flooding risk, and not only is it flooding risk, but it's an increasing threat of flooding risk due to climate change. And in order to reflect that increasing risk, we believe it's necessary to take a step in creating dialogue and studying the feasibility of getting our flood protection standard up to par with many other international cities and with what the climate data shows in order to create a more sustainable future for our waterfront communities. Thank you very much. So now we'll take some questions. I guess if the rest of the group wants to come up, and we'll...
You guys probably don't want to stand in front of the light. I just want to pass it. It was a bad choice.
We have to all talk in the microphone now. Okay, so yeah, so who has a question? Yep.
Just curious, how do you come up with the figure of $2,147.5 billion estimate?
Instead,
I mean, how does one do that? It's obviously an estimate, but what assumptions go into that?
yeah, so this is actually... Okay, that's all.
Microphone.
So this was actually a university study, and of course you can't get this totally accurate, but basically you look at what kind of development is happening in the city. We're bringing more and more density to the waterfront, so that brings more economic assets there. You look into the future, what changes does climate change bring, basically what increased risks, and then you set a metric of what kind of flood scenario we're looking at. This was based off of a 1 in 100 flood scenario for 2070. So 1 in 1,000 would actually be a higher number. But in all honesty, you can't actually accurately measure this, but the point is it's a very, very, very big number, and it means that it's important, and we should definitely look into it.
So is there some historical explanation for why New York does the pathetic 100-year flood rather than the 1,000-year flood planning focus?
Yeah, definitely. Should.
It's kind of a FEMA question as well.
Yeah, this is definitely a FEMA question. So basically, flood insurance in the United States, it works kind of differently than in a lot of other countries. Private companies can't or really don't provide flood insurance, and what it's based off of are FEMA flood maps. So FEMA is a national organization that created this national flood insurance protection policy, protection policy, and it's based off of 1 in 100 year maps, but they do have 1 in 500 year maps. So this study would actually also have to look into working with FEMA and creating accurate 1 in 1,000 year maps, and yeah, it is going above the minimum standard that we have in this country. So that's basically the short answer.
So I had a similar question to Professor Jameson's, but so building on your response to that question, what kinds of, given that 1 in 100 flooding events are the norm and have been the norm in setting all the standards for presumably all the New York City sustainability planning that's happened up to this point, what do you anticipate as some of the points of potential friction for your proposal? I mean, you talked about, well, relatively this is a kind of a fundable, imaginable, doable
study,
proposal,
yeah.
given that it's not going to cost as much because it's research. However, at the level of implementation, what do you anticipate as some of the challenges?
So at the level of implementation, we would not have one financing slide, but like 7 for sure. And of course, there are definitely going to be kickbacks especially from developers. I mean, people who want to develop on the waterfront, it's going to be more expensive to actually raise your building. And so, yes, there are going to be sort of conflicts, especially that. I think that's the one that comes to my mind the most quickly. So,
So how
How
did
the-
Hamburg do it, for instance? Is there anything we can learn from Hamburg's best practice that might inform that question?
Like,
So it's true that Hamburg exists in a very unique situation because half of the city, that land was completely abandoned and it was owned by the city, so they set up a limited liability type corporation that basically took charge of everything, all of the development processes that are associated with it. So that's going to be really different for our waterfront because it's not all government owned, and there are going to be already buildings there, there are going to be private developers, and so it won't be nearly as integrated as we would want it to be. So that's definitely an issue with, you know, getting through bureaucracy of trying to get things done. So,
And this is a
yeah.
feasibility study too, so this would all come up in there, and maybe say 1 in 1,000 year flooding protection is not right for New York City. Maybe we should do 1 in 500, or you know. So what we want to really do is start a dialogue. That's the main point of this.
one of the benefits that New York City has is through plan-wise stuff. I feel like I talk pretty loud. Everyone hear me? Is through a lot of the plans that have been put forth in the last couple of decades. They've really been seeking since the early 90s to have this comprehensive vision of what the waterfront would mean as a multi-use space, where residential space, commercial space, a shipping, recreational, park space, cultural space. So while we meet some friction from developers and other things, I would say that the city does have a strong motivation to redevelop the waterfront towards the goal.
Residential floodgates. Are there any areas of New York that's still residential enough and near the coastline to benefit from those?
I mean, in the floodplain where you have development in like Dumbo, we haven't actually seen this in New York City other than in Penn Station. They actually have floodgates where they can close off in case of flooding to protect the insides of Penn Station. But definitely, I mean, it's been shown that it works, and if a building is in the floodplain, then it definitely is a useful strategy.
Real quick. That solution necessarily doesn't pertain as much to the island of Manhattan itself, because Manhattan actually has a lot of seawalls that were built around it in the early 1800s when shipping was on the rise, the old methods of shipping, but that pertains more to the outer boroughs, which are more residential.
Yeah.
And at a greater risk of flooding as well because of their lower lying elevation. Steve.
Oh, yeah.
I was just confused by one thing. You said that New York City was the sort of planning has been for 1 in 100 year flood event, but you showed a map of what would happen if that happened and it was bad. So it seemed like we're not planned for that.
Yeah, I mean, so maybe Kizzy should actually answer that question from the mayor's office. It is the general framework that they're using. So, when you're actually planning in a city, nothing happens overnight, and these plans are generally pretty new. And when you're talking about actually getting all the buildings up to par, and that's why this initiative is really important to do now, you're talking about decades. So you don't just raise all the buildings, the next year or something. You do so with new development, which is occurring now, and you do so when major retrofits happen. So it's something that takes a while, I guess, is the short answer. And
It's something that the city's working on. You didn't need to say that it's sort of.
Exactly. They're absolutely working on it. They're developing, and we're saying while you're working on it, why not work towards a higher standard? Okay. Well, thank you.